All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to be here today. My name is Ella, and I am the communications manager at the network. We are an intelligence-driven counter-human trafficking organization, and our primary focus is the illicit massage industry. Some of you may know that we held a national convening in January, and this webinar series is a follow-up to that. There's a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen for you to submit your questions throughout the session. And we'll stay on for about 15 minutes at the end to answer those questions. Our panelists today are Jane Anderson, Attorney Advisor with AEquitas, and Nick Odenath, President of Ventura County's Deputy Sheriff Association. They'll be covering how illicit massage businesses are organized and how to employ an all-crimes approach to investigate them. Thank you both for being here today. And with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be able to follow up on the amazing in-person event we had in January in Los Angeles, and to come back here with Nick and be able to present some of this material again to a virtual audience. Let me first say that I am a senior attorney advisor with AEquitas, and we are a proud partner of the network, having been one of the co-hosts for the convening and now partnering with you on this webinar. AEquitas is a nonprofit funded through various federal grants, some private funding as well, and we strive to provide the field from our experience. All of us are former prosecutors that specialized in cases involving domestic violence, sexual violence, stalking, and human trafficking. We want to provide the field with innovative, informed, and hopefully really practical strategies to help move this work forward. We do that in lots of different ways. I encourage you to check out our website. We have a lot of resources there. Obviously, we participate in training events, both in person and virtually. But we're also available for consultations if anything should come up or you have a case-specific question, along with our partnerships and initiatives, including many related to human trafficking task forces around the country. So one of the things that we're really easily able to do is connect you with peers and others that may be experiencing similar challenges or that may have been working on some promising practices. Today, our participation is supported by the funding that we receive through the Office for Victims of Crime, part of the Department of Justice. Of course, we always thank them for their ongoing support, but our opinions today don't necessarily represent the official positions of the Department of Justice. So this is Nick and I back pre-COVID. Looking at the headshot might need to be updated, but just to give you a little bit more background about myself, and then I'll let Nick introduce himself. I am a former prosecutor, having worked in Miami-Dade County, Florida for around 8.5 years. I started doing misdemeanor domestic violence cases, which really opened my eyes to cases that involve complex dynamics that are victim-centered, and that knowledge of trauma and common responses to trauma is really key to figuring out how to achieve justice. So I think that was a great foundation for later on in my career when I started handling human trafficking cases and eventually co-founded our human trafficking unit and tried most of Florida's first human trafficking cases on a state level. So now I take that experience and provide a lot of training and technical assistance around the country in partnership with friends like the network and folks like Sergeant Nick Odenath, who I will now let him introduce himself.
Yes, well, hello, everybody, and thank you to the network for putting together this opportunity to present again. I am a sergeant with the Ventura County Sheriff's Office in California. We're just north of Los Angeles County, and have 21 years of law enforcement experience working in custody settings, in patrol settings, the court system, as well as working as a detective in narcotics and then transitioning to human trafficking investigations. I promoted out of my investigative assignment when I promoted to sergeant, but still very much involved with human trafficking work as a task force liaison for the ECM Enhanced Collaborative Model OVC grant, and work with human trafficking task forces around the United States on a regular basis, and definitely a passion of mine. My experience specifically as an investigator with human trafficking cases, we have developed this organized crime model that we've used in cases where we've had success in actually getting prosecutions for human trafficking, conspiracy to commit human trafficking, and incorporating financial investigations, which we'll talk about today as well, and as well as tax cases and asset forfeiture. So I'm excited to be here, and we certainly encourage questions along the way as we go through the presentation. So thank you all for being here.
So hopefully today we'll look at how investigations can be conducted sort of following the money, right? So we're looking at financial crimes, organized crimes. Nick mentioned tax evasion, co-occurring asset forfeiture proceedings can also help with that. But really what we're looking at is trying to identify illicit businesses that are involved in human trafficking and hold them accountable using this organized crime approach. And it takes collaboration between law enforcement, other related government agencies, prosecutors, victim services, immigration attorneys, and the list goes on. So that collaboration should be woven through this entire presentation and all the work that you're doing. And eventually with that model, one of the goals is that we'd love to have a case where victims are supported and able to participate, but we also recognize that if we're going to put forward these resources and the time it takes to correctly build them, that we want to make sure that we also have cases that can be prosecuted successfully, even when victims are unable to participate. So kind of a dual approach to handling these cases. So before we get really deep into it, I thought we'd have a bit of a conversation about why we talk about human trafficking in the context of illicit massage businesses. I think there's almost this assumption that, yes, these go hand in hand. And I want to kind of disrupt that a little bit and make sure that we're recognizing that this illicit business may or may not include human trafficking. It could include labor exploitation. It could include tax evasion, money laundering, all of those things. But we also want to make sure that we're focused in the work that we do through the Office for Victims of Crime on identifying victims of human trafficking, providing them the support that they need, and holding those those offenders who are committing acts of human trafficking accountable. Even if maybe the ultimate charge is not human trafficking, we're really looking at it from that lens. But we also want to make sure that we're not misidentifying folks either, because there are legitimate, of course, massage businesses, bodywork businesses, legitimate masseuses and therapists that are engaging in this work. And we don't want to have our approach criminalize folks that should not be criminalized. We also have folks that may identify as voluntarily engaging in commercial sex, and that's not really what we're looking at either. We're looking at the human trafficking, that force, fraud, and coercion that is forcing individuals to be engaging in commercial sex, in forced labor under those circumstances. So that's where we're focused. And why is it so important that we're focused there? Because what we do know of individuals that are trafficked within the illicit massage business, they experience any number of harms, ranging from sex trafficking, labor exploitation, and sexual assault and physical abuse. So this experience of the victims is what centers our work, even if we end up taking an investigation in a way that seemingly is looking at finances and organized crime. We never want to stray too far away from why we're doing the work in the first place. So Nick, I want to, after those caveats and setting that foundation, talk to you about like, what are our goals of human trafficking investigations? And I think universally, when we work with task forces around the country, they'd probably tell us it's these three things that we're looking at, right?
Correct. Yeah. And in the approach that we're talking about today, we talk about an organized crime approach. The one thing that is key in that is having also a multidisciplinary approach, and having your service providers who are culturally competent, especially in these types of cases, is crucial to that multidisciplinary approach. And so you really want to have, again, as investigators or prosecutors, we're experts when it comes to the crime that's occurring, but we're not experts in providing victim services. And it takes, again, a team to be able to provide their expertise for these types of cases. And so that has to be a priority when we work through these cases. Absolutely.
Yeah, so that is like the top priority listed here is providing meaningful, I don't have all those words, but we want to provide meaningful, accessible, culturally relevant services to victims of human trafficking. We also, of course, want to, I don't know, get the bad guys, right? Arrest the offenders that are committing these acts of trafficking and related crimes. And then overall, I think one of the reasons that we're partnering with the network is this overall overreaching goal of disrupting the illicit massage industry that is networked, that is organized, and that is facilitating both sex and labor trafficking on a large scale beyond maybe the commercial front that you have as law enforcement or even communities have identified as a potential location for trafficking. But how are we?
And I will,
yeah.
I will say, so, you know, when we talk about disrupting the industry, again, oftentimes it isn't just a single massage establishment that's involved involved in human trafficking. It's often interconnected with other establishments. And again, that's one of the reasons why we're advocating for an organized approach to your investigations, as opposed to trying to attack maybe one location when really the problem is bigger than just that.
Yeah, and what other, you just kind of prompted this question, not to put you on the spot, but is it always just a networks of massage businesses, or do you see other connected in businesses within these networks?
Yeah, in my experience, when we work these cases, often it's a series of different businesses, and oftentimes it's a series of different types of locations. So there may be storefront locations that are involved. There may be residential locations that are involved, hotels, motels, condos or apartments. It's definitely an organized crime, and they're using different locations because they recognize that sometimes law enforcement or investigators may be focused on one area but not focused on others. And so, like any smart business person, they're diversified in the way that they approach this, so that if the storefront is the focus, they know that they've got other areas where they can continue to make money.
Mm-hmm. So how are we doing with this, Nick, in our traditional approaches? And I think I'm happy to say I've seen a real shift over the last couple of years that I've been providing TA across the country, of folks kind of starting to look at these cases differently. But there are still, jurisdictions that really don't have the strategies, the skills, the resources, and are still playing what we often refer to as whack-a-mole, of trying to shut down these businesses one by one. And I think we want to recognize that this traditional approach and hopefully, we're moving away from that steadily, has historically failed victims of trafficking. So while our primary goal is to provide them access to meaningful services, we still see that probable victims are often arrested, that those arrests cause increased debt for attorney's fees, for bail money paid. And so coercive tactics like debt bondage can be increased, and traffickers can end up having even a greater hold on victims because of the operations that we've been doing. Obviously, meaningful access to services and culturally competent services. And I want to thank, we've got some folks in the Q&A letting us know that they have that they're offering their culturally competent services and expertise to folks, so we can share that later. And then the victims are continuing to work within the illicit massage business more often than not, whether that business moved to another business or and moved across the country. And then, the good work that we're trying to do, trying to make law enforcement a safe place for disclosure, is actually potentially the opposite effect is happening, and that we're reinforcing fear of law enforcement that likely the traffickers are also using again to coerce victims into this trafficking situation.
Yeah, I mean, one of the issues that, and I think if anybody that's done this work for any length of time, and I'll speak from my own personal experience and my own personal mistakes. The way I was trained and the way I understood how to address these issues from a law enforcement perspective was to, do a sting operation and go in and make contact with the people at the establishment to try to determine if there's any crime occurring at the location, including human trafficking. And we may bring code compliance with us, and we may even determine there's enough evidence to close the location. And what I found, though, is a couple of things. One, we didn't have culturally competent service providers there. So victims weren't getting services. Two, although we may have closed the establishment down, again, because it's part of organized crime, it would open up very quickly again under somebody else's name. And sometimes it would open within the same day before we had even finished our paperwork. And so we recognized that it didn't work. It wasn't working, right? And what we weren't doing is addressing the fact that this is a bigger issue that required more advanced investigative techniques, and also required, again, a team of experts that specialize in the different spaces that we needed. And that's when we started to evolve and change, and started to see success in not only putting together solid cases, but also in actually getting victim services and eliminating some of the barriers that the victims experience. And one good example of that is a lot of the victims that we came in contact with were in the United States without any status. They were here on expired travel visa. Maybe they were seeking political asylum. But the fact that we were able to come in with our service providers and work jointly with our federal partners and provide them with continued presence, that's a barrier that's eliminated right away with a victim. And it's not very complicated to do, but it makes a huge difference to the victim in letting the victim know that we're here to help, and that we're getting them to experts who understand the culture, who specifically understand the trauma associated and the cultural ties to the trauma that are occurring with that trafficking situation, and that we're going to get them services so that they can get out of this experience that they've been put in.
It's been fantastic to recognize, this wasn't working, and to try something different instead of the same thing over and over again, which we tend to see. And There are likely some arrests that's happening, and you might be looking at, pressure from leadership about, numbers, or about community tips that are coming in because somebody's recognizing this in their community and asking for a law enforcement response. So I think there's a lot of pressure to do something, and to do something quickly. And what ends up happening is we continue to fail these goals because, of course, we're not arresting the true sort of offenders. Instead, we're more likely arresting victims than those who are actually benefiting from that exploitation that's occurring. Those investigative techniques are not actually leading to the traffickers because of limits on resources, or just not being able to have the time to rethink, okay, what's really happening in this business, and who's really benefiting from it. And then, of course, as we arrest those women mostly that are working within the illicit massage business, but not exclusively, we're also further harming them by involving them in the criminal justice system and adding more barriers to disclosure and more reasons why, these victim services or law enforcement interventions are not working to build that trust and rapport. So I love what you said, Nick, which is like, first off, let's recognize what are these barriers to disclosure. A lot of it is fear-based from the traffickers, but there are the realities of, immigration-based fears and limitations. And so if we know that's a barrier, like, why are we not working with immigration attorneys, providing really meaningful language access and using the immigration relief tools that, the legislature has given us, that are meant to be crime fighting tools, the continued presence and T visas, so that we can actually build that case against the true exploiters and traffickers. And then eventually, doing a better job, because right now not doing such a great job, but doing a better job to disrupt the industry. So like you said, it's shocking for me. I knew they opened up quickly, but for you to say while you were still doing their paperwork, they were opening up in a different location, really exemplifies that even if we're doing these temporary band-aids or temporary fixes, we're not disrupting that industry that's facilitating trafficking.
And I would add to that, and so when we talk about this organized crime approach, one of the most important pieces of assembling an organized criminal investigation is the pre-planning piece. And what does that look like? That means you bring together the experts that you need. And what you're going to find is you're going to put a core group together, and you're going to have a conversation about how to approach this issue, this problem, and you're going to have to bring in more people, right? So, for example, with us, we worked with our service providers and said, how can we best interact with the victims at first point of contact? What's the best techniques as far as ensuring that the victims understand we're there to help? And what we learned really quickly was even the service providers admitted, we don't understand the culture well enough to provide services in these cases. And so we need to bring in a cultural expert to help us in that space. And we also need to bring in linguists who understand Mandarin, Taiwanese, Cantonese, so that when we come in contact with these victims, we can actually communicate with them. And so it's those types of things that are crucial in putting together an organized crime case, is the pre-planning, so that it isn't a knee-jerk reaction when you get a complaint or you get a tip. You're not just going there to address the issue without having a plan in place.
I think that really shows the humility that it takes to approach these cases from a different angle, by looking at it and saying, you know what, we haven't been meeting our goals. And instead of just moving forward and continuing, being like, let's take a step back. let's bring in other experts. Let's bring in folks that do know these pieces that we don't know, and let's rethink how we can approach them. And I think that's that piece of humility, whether that be cultural humility or just, let's look at a different model. Let's look at this organized crime model. And I know, Nick, having worked with you enough, I think, it's integral to you that you had that experience of doing narcotics cases and building a case in this way, in kind of a different circumstance, but still the idea of let's look at the bigger network and let's not just keep getting this low hanging fruit, but what do we really want to be achieving here?
Correct. Yeah. And so once you recognize that, listen, this isn't one location, this is really tied to a series of locations, it's organized, there's co-conspirators that are involved and each of them have a role, then we have to use those techniques to be able to attack that issue. And so again, having service providers, they're the experts, they're working with the victims, but now as an investigator, I'm going to deploy techniques that really shouldn't be that unfamiliar with us. They just are going to take more time than a sting operation, because the goal is to dismantle this organization so they can no longer victimize additional victims if they were allowed to continue to operate. And so part of that is looking at their motive, right? What's the motive in these cases? And that is to make money, right? And so if the motive is to make money, then as investigators, we should be investigating the money. We should be looking into bank records. We should be looking in the movement of the money from the business to the organized crime piece that's working behind the scenes. And admittedly, when I started these types of trafficking cases, I did not know how to do any of that. And so again, you work with people who are experts in that area. We recruited district attorney investigators locally who do fraud cases, and they look at bank records on a regular basis. They know how to look for money laundering. They know how to look for suspicious activity through bank statements and deposits. And they were able to put a case together where we were able to prove money laundering. And you bring a tax expert together. The tax expert, again, is going to look at, did your suspects in these cases, did they file taxes? Have they avoided paying taxes? And I can tell you, at least in California, whether you're making money legitimately or illicitly, the state is still going to collect taxes from you, right? And so there's an opportunity, again, to attack the issue from multiple angles to make your case more successful. And by attacking it in multiple ways, your human trafficking case, which is very hard to prove, I'm sure we all know that in this meeting, you may not rise to the level of human trafficking, but you may have a really solid financial case, a really solid tax case that's going to shut the organization down anyways. And by this multi-approach and attacking it from different angles, you're going to find a lot more success.
Let me ask you, as you brought in those district attorney investigators, and you're looking at folks that you're maybe not always partnering with, but are either sworn law enforcement or working for government agencies, and they have that expertise of whether it be like fraud or financial crimes, white collar crimes. Have you also worked with like forensic accountants and folks like that to help you translate those spreadsheets that I know I also, when I looked at them, when I started doing trafficking cases, I was very intimidated by that financial aspect of the case?
Yeah, so was I, admittedly. I mean, you give me a narcotics case, I'm fine. You give me bank records and I start to have heart palpitations, right? So absolutely. So we would bring in the investigators, and they taught me, they taught my partner, and showed us how to look at bank records, and they would do some of the work for us as well. But again, it's organized crime. And so what we found is well, we've identified, 20 or 30 bank accounts in which they're funneling money through, right? And so then it becomes a matter of tracking the movement of the money from the brothel location to oftentimes an asset that they're ultimately, whether that be a house or a car, whatever they're buying to clean the money. And we leaned heavily on the FBI and the HSI, who have forensic accountants on staff, to then go through the bank records after we've done some initial analysis for money laundering activity or illicit suspicious activity, have them actually map it out for us, and actually lay out the movement of the money from brothel location to asset. And then it helped us in the asset forfeiture case when ultimately we're taking assets away from the criminal organization so that they can no longer operate.
Yeah. So I think this is really the change that we want to see. And some of it is pretty simple. Do not arrest victims. And that may seem controversial to some folks, but it shouldn't be. If we're looking at folks that are probable victims that we identify as victims of trafficking, we should not be arresting them in hopes that that's going to get us more information. I think that's a vestige of sort of our vice operations, where you sort of arrest to get to the higher means. But if we take a step back, we recognize that there's so many reasons why we should not be doing that, beyond the fact that it's just not a successful way to investigate. And then instead, of course, we should be providing that meaningful access to appropriate services, including things like immigration relief and criminal record relief as well. And then arresting the offenders. And I think what you said sort of a while ago, Nick, was this idea of that you're trained to go into the business and look for criminal activity. And the first and most immediate thing that I think folks look at is like the acts of commercial sex, prostitution's happening. That's where we're going to focus. We can make immediate arrests on that. And this really does require us to say, let's look beyond that. Because if we get stuck there, we never get to the other pieces of it. And as a prosecutor, having tried many human trafficking cases, sex trafficking and labor trafficking, I can tell you in my sex trafficking cases, the element of commercial sex was never the thing I was worried about proving. That is never the thing that I'm stuck on as far as my evidence goes. So you really don't need to be focusing on that. And instead, we should be thinking about how do we investigate and get to the folks that are benefiting from the exploitation of others. And the answer, of course, being that follow the money, looking at those networks, looking at other illicit activity, of course, including human trafficking as well. So
yeah, I'm going to jump in really quick if you don't mind. So as it relates to the victims, and you're right, the commercial sex piece is always the first thing that you encounter, and whether that be because of escort ads or because of some initial research that you've done, and again, all of us in this meeting are experts in human trafficking. And I think oftentimes the one piece that we forget is that with human trafficking, often the victims are being forced to commit crime. And the forced criminality piece is important to remember in these cases. And so we wouldn't arrest a victim in any other case, and we shouldn't be doing it here in human trafficking cases. And so in that respect, when we're putting these criminal cases together, they shouldn't be focused on the victim. We should be getting the victim resources. Our cases should be focused on the suspects. Who are the ones who are involved in the conspiracy that's occurring? And that's, again, where you start getting into the organized crime piece. You start looking at electronics. You start looking into business records. That'll get you into financials. And that's how you start putting together these cases. So that is a key piece to this.
I like how you framed that as the forced criminality. And I think it goes to this idea, and whether it's because historically we haven't approached them correctly, or whether we haven't figured out some of that cultural pieces, or we're just not able to minimize those barriers to disclosure enough. But we continue to have challenges of encountering mostly women working in illicit massage businesses who we then say, they refuse to talk to law enforcement. They don't talk to us. They don't tell us what's going on. And because of that, then I think there is a sense of like, well, we're providing them lots of opportunities to tell us that they're victims, and they're not. And then kind of all of a sudden working in this counterproductive way of looking at them as criminals and arresting them. So I think first and foremost, we need to change our practices. Then we need to bring in those experts to help us better understand. And we may then eventually get to a better place as far as working with, in a trauma-informed way, victims that we encounter within the illicit massage businesses. But we also, one of the other challenges that I often hear is we just can't seem to connect the business owners or anyone sort of higher than maybe the manager that's on site to the trafficking that's happening there. And I think this is a great place to start talking about how do we build organized crime cases, because if you're a good organized criminal, you are going to insulate yourself. You're going to distance yourself. You're going to make this hard for investigations. And so how do you start making these connections, and so that you're not just looking at, the folks that are physically present in the establishment, but you're looking at people that are taking the money from the establishment and using it to purchase houses, other businesses, cars, and that type of thing.
Yeah. And this is really where, as an investigator, we take it to the next level. And again, you use all the resources that you would normally use in a narcotics investigation, or even a homicide investigation, where you're trying to track down your suspect in these cases. Because you're right, in organized crime cases, the true suspects have insulated themselves, right? And oftentimes they have hired people to sign the business license with the city, so that they've insulated themselves that way. The manager that's at the location is often, again, being paid by the owner to be there and just oversee the place. But again, a lot of times these people have cell phones, these people have vehicles, and we as investigators establish probable cause to show that the manager's involved in criminal activity. And then we can start writing search warrants for cell phones. We can start writing search warrants for trackers. We can install pole cameras. There's a lot of techniques that we can use, that we have access to identify the next level of this conspiracy. And that's really, when we talk about organized crime, that's what you do. You also do the same thing with the financial piece of it, right? These people often have bank records, right? Or you do surveillance and you see them making deposits at a local branch. Again, that's all evidence, and then gives you probable cause to build additional search warrants together to put together the case. It's going to get you to who your primary suspects are in these cases. So it can be done, but it takes some additional work to get to that point.
And I think one of the game changers that occurred when we started looking at human trafficking cases in Miami was that I started working much more closely with law enforcement. So instead of law enforcement bringing me a case that they had already sort of done the investigation, and then they were like, here, Jane, go charge and prosecute this case, we started collaborating earlier on. So bringing me in and say, hey, we've got this target, or we've got this location that we're looking at. And we were able to brainstorm together and kind of build off some creative energy of like, okay, what if we did a poll cam? What if we were able to do some surveillance, those techniques that you're bringing up. And then of course, having the early collaboration also allowed me to be helping write those search warrants, making sure that I was there doing that sort of legal analysis that was necessary. And when it came time to charge, we had already been working together. So the risk of law enforcement to expend resources and time and energy was a lot lower, because at the end of the day, they were much more confident, well, we're going to be able to get a charge out of this because we've got the prosecutor right here with us, kind of looking at this case with us. And so that's when we really started looking at, okay, what other crimes can we charge that have the teeth that we want? And we started looking at our state level RICO. Otherwise, sometimes it's called racketeering, organized crime. Every state has a version of it, even though we typically think of RICO or racketeering as being maybe federal crimes. There are these state equivalent cases, and they often have sort of equally strong sentencing mandates as our trafficking charges. And so at the end of the day, after all this work, we're still able to really hold offenders accountable if we've built up these organized crime charges. So I've got always hard to talk on a national to a national audience about state criminal statutes because they are going to look a little bit different. But this is a place where AEquitas can provide you a statutory analysis, including state-specific case law as to how to build this in your jurisdiction. But typically what we're looking at is this three-part analysis. There needs to be some sort of enterprise. Shockingly, the law always has a lot of nuances. And so when I heard enterprise, I was like, oh, wow, we're talking about the mafia or that kind of thing. But actually, if you look at the definition of enterprise, it usually can be a formal or informal group of people. Often it can also be a sole enterprise. And so it can really cover any type of sort of collaborative criminal activity when there's more than one person involved with a similar sort of end goal. And so don't be tricked by this word enterprise, that it has to be some really formal, org chart related business, although often we do get that in their illicit massage business cases. Depending on your statute, that enterprise has to be engaged in a certain number of incidents. It's usually like 2 or 3. So again, not a very high bar to charge organized crime. And then the incidents have to be related to what we call a predicate crime. So it can be enumerated mostly. Usually if you look at your organized crime statutes, it'll have a list of like somewhere like 50 types of crimes that fall under this. Almost all of them include crimes of human trafficking, prostitution, money laundering, mostly financial crimes are covered. Exploitation is covered. Labor trafficking is sometimes included. Witness intimidation is usually included. And so it really allows you to build up a charge that is sort of, I refer to it as sort of this umbrella charge. So racketeering is a continuing offense. It can involve different types of crimes, different incidents, different parties, but you get to kind of all wrap it up under one umbrella. And it's an incredibly powerful tool for law enforcement and prosecutors to hold offenders accountable. And usually there's also a conspiracy to commit, so you can start adding some of these crimes together. I know you've charged this under the California state statute. And how would you typically describe like the enterprises that you were charging?
Yeah, we would use our criminal profiteering, or what we call Little RICO in California. And So we would, what we found in the cases is it wasn't terribly hard to identify the main suspects in our cases. We were usually able to get there within a couple of search warrants. And usually we would get there through cell phone evidence, tracker evidence, and just some good old physical surveillance. And so once we had that information, we would be able to show how they were working in concert with each other to commit the crime. And oftentimes it was a conspiracy case. So we may have one person who did the driving of our victims, the driving of the money in the cases from brothel location to a financial institution or to the owner or suspects in our case. And by piecing those incidents together with the group that we had identified, we were able to show that this was a conspiracy, and then able to prove the trafficking through the coercion that we were able to identify again through physical evidence. And again, oftentimes the evidence that we get was not through victim statements, but it was again through physical evidence, serving search warrants where the victim's bank information, passports, any ID was all at the suspect's house. I mean, stuff like that, where it's black and white, and it's consistent with our state penal code, that is trafficking, with everything else that we were able to show.
Yeah, a lot of state statutes for human trafficking include an enumerated means of force, fraud, and coercion, which is withholding identification documents. So just the physical location of those documents being away from the victim can almost in and of itself prove that enumerated means if your statute describes that. And even if your statute doesn't specifically say that, it's definitely going to be one of the little pieces of the puzzle to put together my case of this is a coercive atmosphere where victims aren't free to leave because they don't have their identity documents.
And I will say the one piece is we did work with, we had vertical prosecution. And so we worked with our prosecutor from day one. And I was on the phone with the prosecutor when every step of the way, this is what we found. What do you think? And then what do you think we should do next? And that relationship is key with a case like this. That has to happen.
Thanks, Nick, for that extra plug for the prosecutors.
Anytime.
So likewise, with my heart palpitations over looking at a spreadsheet, I also remember thinking, money laundering and just thinking that's way too complicated. There's no way that I could prosecute that or that we'd have enough evidence. And in fact, I was shocked when I read our state money laundering statute in Florida and have since done similar statutory analysis for a lot of states around the country, realizing how simple it is once you get past that initial sort of heart palpitations. But money laundering is in and of itself not a complicated or complex crime to prove. Most statutes are going to define money laundering as someone who is earning money from criminal activity, somebody who's spending money that they know came from criminal activity, or someone that is hiding money that came from criminal activity. Happy to, again, do a statutory analysis for you, anyone that's out there working in a different state, but it really does kind of boil down to these simple three pieces of the statute. And once you recognize that, it's almost a foregone conclusion that there will be proof of money laundering in any illicit business, because you've got the criminal activity. And again, that's not the hard part to prove if you're, looking at commercial sex, but you could also be looking at other criminal activity that is occurring. And then all it is finding somebody that got the money from it, spent the money on it, or is hiding the money to avoid some sort of tax consequences or other reasons. So the more difficult thing is let's make sure that we're connecting the criminal activity. And again, the criminal activity, even though we're asking you all not to hyper focus on acts of commercial sex that's happening, it is going to be what ties you together for these other charges. So how do we connect the criminal activity with the real offender? Because the common defense is going to be, well, I had no idea what was happening in those, private rooms. I just thought I was running a very legitimate massage business, and whatever these individuals were doing on their own in the privacy of their massage rooms, I have nothing to do with that. And I'm sure, Nick, you've heard that defense.
Oh, many times. Yeah. And again, using the tools that you've got and writing search warrants for your suspects' phones, right, where there's communication in there is going to be helpful. Doing traditional surveillance, right, showing are your victims being transported to and from these locations, and are they being where are they being housed? And I often tell people, a lot of times we get hyper focused on the sex trafficking piece of these cases, but think about the labor trafficking angle in these cases as well, because oftentimes these victims are working 6 or 7 days a week. They're working for 16 to 18-hour days, often late into the night. They're not making a lot of money. There are pieces there, and again, it's a matter of looking at the whole picture and putting that together and exploring every avenue in these cases through search warrants and surveillance and any other tools that you have to identify the trafficking piece.
And we can prove state of mind and knowledge in circumstantial ways, and so this should not be the hurdle preventing us from charging the true traffickers, the true folks that are benefiting from this exploitation. So as prosecutors, we provide circumstantial evidence all the time. It's often more damning than direct evidence, because I hate to say this, but sometimes it's like it walks like a duck, it looks like a duck. Our jurors are not going to be caught up on the fact of like what is going on, what is the true nature of this business, especially if we look at the advertisements, the way the business is set up. If you've got photos showing the living conditions within the business, the security measures, if you've got surveillance showing the clientele, the hours, the fact that there's an ATM on site and it's a cash business, and that there are illegitimate licenses related to the business that the business was getting on behalf of the victims. All of these things together are going to be able to have to meet that burden of proof to connect anybody who's related to this business to the knowledge of the illicit nature of the business. And then once you follow the money beyond that, you will be confident that you'll be able to show that connection between the illicit activity and the true offenders. So I know we talked about the services. We started this off saying we're going to talk about this organized crime approach. And I think the tools of the statutes that we have that can address this, the types of investigations that you went through, Nick, are really going to be key. I just never want to lose focus on the fact that for me, the ideal situation is not only are we holding the offenders accountable for the money laundering, the racketeering, maybe we're able to even show a human trafficking case through that physical evidence. But as a prosecutor, I want to center victims in the criminal justice system. That's why I do the work that I do. And I would ideally have a victim who is able to participate and be involved in that, in the resolution of that case and the disposition of that case, whether that be trial or plea negotiations. And so the keys to doing that, I think, are first and foremost, not arresting victims, partnering with service providers that have that cultural sensitivity, that have that cultural competency. There's more and more service providers that are popping up that are, I've heard the term that they're by and for the folks that they serve. So the service providers look like and have experiences that match up with the victims that they're serving. Survivor-led services are always incredibly useful. But that language access, that specific trauma related to the culture, all of that, we need to start building more and more capacity in our communities to have those folks there to help us when we are intersecting with victims in the illicit massage business. And then the planning ahead, of course, that we do in all of our cases, but again, with that cultural sensitivity of providing the shelter, the clothing, food services, and addressing those immigration concerns. And then, of course, the evidence-based case. So if we're not able to have victims participate, then we want to make sure that we still have a case that can be successfully prosecuted without victims' testimony at trial. And so some of those key tools that we have are those advertisements that have words of solicitation. Those are going to be non-hearsay under the law. Those should be admitted without victim testimony. Again, great case law to support that. We have the tool as prosecutors to litigate forfeiture by wrongdoing, making victim statements admissible where we have evidence of witness intimidation. And probably we should expect witness intimidation to be happening in these cases, and we should be planning for that and looking to investigate it when and how it happens. And then, of course, those additional charges that can be substantiated with victim testimony. Those are your key tools to be able to build an evidence-based case that you can go forward with. Okay, so we're closing out here. We are gonna, I think Ella's gonna share that too. We're gonna stay on after the recording ends to answer any questions that you might have, but hopefully this conversation has put us in a position where moving forward, we can build those collaborative efforts we can be as networked as those illicit massage businesses. We can build upon the networks of our expert allied partners and within our own agencies to charge the offenders with the crimes that they're committing as this overall illicit business goes forward. And the keys to that, of course, are the money and the financial crimes and the fact that this is a networked, organized crime, and that we should be looking at it that way, and we should be equally organized. Nick, I'll let you have any last thoughts on that.
Yeah, I just to highlight a couple of things that we've talked about already, just to get you started, right? If this is new for you, this is you're looking at this new approach because you haven't done it yet. I highly encourage you to do what I mentioned earlier, and that's the conversations with your other experts and working together as a team to better understand what resources you need to tackle the issue in your respective areas. That is a key first step, and then taking it one step at a time and building on that. And I offer to any of you in this meeting to use me as a resource if you need, and if you get stuck, I'm happy to help, right? Because when it's your first time, it can be a challenge, and having resources available to phone a friend when you need to is also an important piece of this. And believe me, I did it quite a bit when I started down this road of really relooking at how we tackle this problem.
And I can attest to Nick's generosity with his time and expertise as far as helping other folks build the response that eventually led to a lot of successful outcomes in Ventura County. And likewise around this country, there's quite a few examples that we luckily can now point towards to say, hey, this is how it was done, and it was done successfully. So this is my contact information. Please check out our website and look at the various resources that we have available to those of you that are working in this field. This is Nick's contact information. Again, really generous with his time. We thank again OVC for their ongoing support. Here's some additional resources that you can find on AEquitas's website, but also through the OVC training and technical assistance program, a ton online, including a task force e-guide, an operations roadmap, and then one of our other partners, IACP, the International Association of Chiefs of Police, they have a learning portal as well with a lot of webinars, resources, and whatever you might want to move your work forward. And again, on behalf of AEquitas, I thank you. I thank the network for hosting this series, and Nick and I, and we'll hang on for folks that might have some questions.
Thank you so much, Jane and Nick, for this wealth of information and just such a digestible 360 view of this winning approach. So as Jane said, this officially ends today's session if you need to jump, but we'll stay on for about 15 more minutes to answer questions. For anyone leaving, don't forget to tune in next week on Tuesday and Wednesday at 2 p.m. Eastern time for our last two sessions that will be specifically focused on cultural competency. And with that, well, we already have our first question answered because here is Nick's information. Also have a question for emailing the resources, so I'll go ahead and share that following this session. And our first question is, how do you justify securing more resources for your investigation and task force, including surveillance tools, financial investigators, etc.?
Yeah, it was initially a real challenge for me. That was probably the biggest hurdle for me because with our unit, it was myself and at the time, one other investigator that was part-time trafficking. So we had 1.5 investigators that were handling trafficking in Ventura County. And when we recognized that we weren't having success using what I'd call traditional investigative techniques, the first conversation I had was with our service provider, but the second conversation I had was with our administration, and it was basically an ask that we be able to lean on other agencies for their expertise. So obviously we had our relationship with our service providers, but on the law enforcement side, I asked that we be able to have access to a district attorney investigator for the financial piece. We reached out to the California Franchise Tax Board and asked if we could have access to one of their special agents. We reached out to the FBI and asked if one of their special agents would help in co-casing with us. And then we reached out to the U.S. Attorney's Office and one of the AUSAs and asked if they would assist in federal forfeiture as we moved along and identifying suspect assets. And by developing relationships with other agencies and partnering with other agencies, that's how we were able to be successful. And again, it's a multidisciplinary approach with a law enforcement lens. We're bringing in people from other agencies that have expertise in areas that we don't have, and they're able to carry some of the load. And so that's ultimately how we were able to have success. And so we got through our first case, we were able to get a filing and ultimately get a successful prosecution. And then as we moved along, the people were very willing to assist at that point once they recognized that we could have success using that model.
Yeah, success begets success, right, Nick?
Correct.
And we actually hosted a panel in January at the convening with this question at the forefront, which was, how do you now that you're bought into this model, how do you get buy-in from partners and from your leadership? And one of the other participants on the panel, Lara Mullins from Denver, talked about how she basically sold it to law enforcement as, just give me one of these cases. Instead of 6 weeks, give me 6 months, or I can't remember, 6 hours to 6 weeks. But she basically said, let's just do one, and you can pick it. You know, you pick which one, law enforcement. Maybe they did some targeting, maybe they saw the same one pop up, or maybe they were working with folks like the network that had helped them map things out in their community, and said, just give me this one and let's try it this way and let's see what happens. And she talked about having to go around to those partners. But I liked sort of the way that she sold it, which is, I'm not asking you to revamp everything right now. Let's just do it, you know, step by step. And again, she and I are very alike in the fact that, and it sounds like Nick, the prosecutor you worked with as well, which was, she was there along the way. So she wasn't asking law enforcement to do anything that she wasn't willing to do, as far as the resources, the time, and the effort that she spent on the case as well. And I think that from my point of view as the prosecutor, that was probably one of my biggest game changers as well, was just demonstrating, you know, walking the walk of, I am going to put the effort and my resources in the same way that I'm asking you to.
Wonderful, thank you. Our next question is, if a trafficker is convicted, how much time will he or she serve in your state?
Wow. I think it really depends on the state, depends on the judge, it depends on so many things. That's my lawyer answer. But we're seeing significantly higher sentences when we're taking this approach, because I think judges and juries are seeing the reality of the extent of the criminal activity and exploitation that's happening, instead of seeing these as prostitution cases, which can sometimes be minimized, and including the harm to victims being minimized. So we're seeing a big improvement. I don't want to put a number out there. I don't know, Nick, if you want to share any specific cases that you know of, but I think we're getting that number's moving up.
It is moving up, I'll say, in our cases. And so, and when I say our cases, I'm talking 5 or 6 years ago now. Our primary suspects were sentenced, and mind you, they pled guilty prior to prelim, right? So they took a plea deal, but they were doing anywhere from 10 to 12 years state prison. And that's for conspiracy to commit human trafficking. That's money laundering charges that were tacked on. And then they had criminal filings on, some of them criminal filings for tax evasion, as well as a whole slew of fines and fees tacked on to the judgment.
Great outcome, Nick.
Absolutely. Our next question is, have you noticed in any of your investigations massage parlors that are connected or owned by the same group of people, but intentionally operate as a legitimate business? Is this common or another red flag to launder money?
The answer is yes. It's interesting. So the one thing I didn't mention during the presentation is that in a couple of our larger investigations, we also used wiretap to gather additional evidence of trafficking, state wiretap. And in some of the conversations, yes, because this is an organized crime group, then they'll have brothels that are really not producing a lot of money, but just given the volume of money that they are producing from some of their other locations, they need to have another business that they can funnel money through, open bank accounts with. And so that doesn't mean that there's nothing illicit happening at those locations, but it definitely is more designed to funnel money than it is for, commercial sex or something else. So it can happen in my experience.
I'll also plug that AEquitas is hosting a webinar on the use of state wiretaps in human trafficking cases, which we've also wrangled Nick into co-presenting with my colleague Jennifer Dolly. So go to our website and sign up for that. It's going to be taking place on April 11th. You have that information, but I don't know if folks at the network also wanted to answer that, but this commingling of legitimate and illegitimate businesses, I think, is common that we see in any networked criminal enterprise.
Absolutely. Thank you. And our next question is, did you have any conversations about returning the money seized to the survivors, assuming that you had access to the records?
That's a great question. Thanks for bringing it up, and something that we don't talk enough about, which is that when we do these financial investigations, one of the main benefits is that we're also going to be able to identify illicit money for purposes of like a financial asset forfeiture. An asset forfeiture, most statutes require that one of the primary places that money goes is to pay the restitution to any victims in the case. So as a prosecutor, I should be building up a restitution case for the victims, and I can do that with the help of wage and hour. And there's some great case law, because originally there was some pushback about, can you get, back wages as restitution when you were engaged in illicit activity? That question has been answered with quite a bit of really solid case law, thanks to the efforts of CAST and other organizations. And so victims should be able to receive restitution from any asset forfeiture. Of course, victims of trafficking almost always also have civil remedies at their disposal. So if assets were seized and there are civil remedies, you could also work with civil attorneys to make sure that those seized assets are given as if any settlement or judgment is from a civil case. But criminally, that criminal restitution should be one of the first things, if not the first thing, that is provided after any asset forfeiture.
And I'll just piggyback off of that. This is one of the areas where I was really naive as an investigator. It wasn't an area of expertise for me. And in our first case, we totally missed the mark on restitution. And it wasn't through, it was through other education, like this training here, where I learned about restitution and actually had a conversation with our prosecutor, so that the next case, that was something that we made sure happened. And so it's definitely something that has to be a piece of this multidisciplinary approach in your cases.
And another pitch, AEquitas has specific resources on this related to human trafficking on our website. And if you want to search for those or reach out to me, I'm happy to provide them to you directly.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both so much. This finishes our Q&A session. I just want to thank you again for your humble and expert leadership that you guys provide in this field, and it's always an honor to work with you. And thank you to all of our attendees as well. I'm just going to share this flyer really quickly for the rest of our webinar series. And with that, I hope you all have a great day.
Thanks so much. Take care, everyone.
Yeah, thank you all.
Thank you.
Take care.
Have a good one. Bye.